Good evening and welcome to Copperfield's Books virtual event with Frederick Weisel. My name is Jamie Madsen and I'm the Marketing and Events Coordinator here at Copperfield's Books, and I will also be your host for the evening. Copperfield's has been committed to community, literature, and creating community together since our founding in 1981. We're a small book chain in Northern California, as I'm sure many of you know, and I always like to take a moment here to thank you all for your continued support in the last year, because it has been tough and we wouldn't be here without you, so thank you. A couple of housekeeping items for tonight. We will be using the chat box to provide links to view upcoming Copperfield's events, links to purchase tonight's title, as well as a 10% discount code for use on our website. And it will also include my contact details for post-event information. Additionally, Frederick has agreed to send signed book plates. So I will be sending out information on how to get that. If you've previously purchased tonight's title, then we will definitely give you one as well. So just look out for that. Additionally, the Q&A box will be your go-to with any questions or comments for the speaker. If you look at the bottom, as many of you have seen on the Zoom screen, you will see an icon that says Q&A. Please post your questions and comments here, and we will get to it at the end of the event. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce tonight's author, Frederick Weisel. Frederick has been a writer and editor for more than 30 years. He graduated from Antioch College and has an MA in Victorian Literature and History from the University of Leicester in England. His short stories were awarded an Artist Fellowship from the Massachusetts Arts and Humanities Foundation, and his articles have appeared in the Boston Globe, Washington Post, and Christian Science Monitor. The Silenced Women is his debut novel, and he is currently working on the third novel in the series. He lives in Santa Rosa with his wife. With that, I'm thrilled to hand it over to you, Fred. I can't wait to hear about this mystery novel set in our very little Santa Rosa. So take over.
All right. Thank you, Jamie. And thank you all for coming. I hope you're all safe and well. I especially want to thank those of you on the East Coast who are staying up late tonight. And I'd like to thank Copperfield Books for hosting this event. It's a real honor for me as a writer to have this opportunity. Over the years, I've attended many events sponsored by Copperfields for other authors, including John Irving and Ian Rankin. Years ago, I even took part in a Copperfields event called Have Dinner with a Mystery Author. And I shared a meal with Jeff Abbott, the thriller writer. And as a result of that dinner, Jeff and I became friends. And as you might have noticed, on the back of my book, Jeff wrote a very generous blurb. So I'm very grateful to Copperfields for this opportunity. And if you are local and you haven't bought a book yet, I hope you'll buy it from Copperfields. Tonight, I look forward to telling you a little bit about this novel and answering your questions. I'm going to assume that many of you have not read it yet, so I'll try not to give away too much. I'll talk about the book for 20 minutes or so, and I'll talk about the setting for the novel, the plot, the characters, how I came to write the novel, and my process of writing. Then I'll read a short excerpt. After that, I'll try to answer your questions. And so as I go along, as Jamie said, if you would add questions to the Q&A box, that would be great. So let's get into it. The Silenced Women is a mystery, and it's in a subgenre known as a police procedural. It follows 5 detectives in a Santa Rosa Police Department's VCI team, or the Violent Crime Investigations Team. Now, this is a real thing, by the way, although my depiction of them is entirely fictional. For those of you who normally read literary fiction, not mysteries and crime fiction, I wanted to start out and say something here up front and to insert a kind of content warning or trigger warning. This story is about homicide. The novel is gritty. In fact, if you read the blurb on the front of the novel from my friend Zoe Ferraris, she says, "You're in for a smart and gritty ride." So frankly, it may not be everybody's cup of tea. I get that. But I'll also say that I tried to use the elements of the literary novel, such as metaphor and interior monologue, to write the story and describe the characters. Also, I tried to avoid graphic descriptions of violence. I love all kinds of mysteries, but I'm not a big fan of the more graphic ones like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. So let's start with the setting. The setting for the novel is distinctive. It's Santa Rosa, Sonoma County, and San Francisco. I've lived in Santa Rosa for almost 40 years, and I wanted to set the book in this locale. Now, there's a tradition among mystery writers to make up fictional names for their locations. If you've ever read Sue Grafton, you know she sets her novels in Santa Barbara, but she calls it Santa Teresa. My novel doesn't do that. My novel uses the real names of locations. In this sense, it's more like the mystery novels of Michael Connelly, who uses the real names of neighborhoods in Los Angeles. The reason I use the real names is because few novels have been set here locally, and I wanted to have the sense of the real place. So the story refers to Spring Lake Park, which is a real park. And it uses the names of streets in Santa Rosa, and it describes Dry Creek Valley, which is about 30 minutes north of here, and the South Beach neighborhood of San Francisco. This also applies to names outside of Sonoma County. In the sections of the novel about Eden's time at Mount Holyoke College, the novel uses the real names of the dormitory and the library. So I'll say a few words about the plot. The plot of The Silenced Women is what's known as an inverted detective story or reverse mystery. This just means that the novel reveals the killers early on. So as a reader, you're not trying to figure out who the killer is because I tell you in chapter 3. If you're old enough, you may remember a TV show in the 1970s called Columbo, starring Peter Falk. In that show, the crime was always shown in the first 5 minutes. So the viewers knew the killer even if Columbo didn't. The story in Columbo and in my novel is not to discover who the killer is, but to watch how the detectives figure it out. So if the shorthand for a traditional mystery is known as a whodunit, the shorthand for the inverted mystery is how catch 'em. Now you may be saying to yourself, oh, probably the reason he did that was because he didn't know how to write a real mystery. But really, I wanted readers to be able to get to know the killer and his friends. I wanted to describe them throughout the whole book. And if I was going to do that, I need to make clear why they were in the book. One benefit of this reverse mystery, which I didn't actually figure out until I finished, is that it puts the focus less on plot and more on character. And this aligned with my own general interest in other mysteries, which is more on character, not plot. The second book in the series, which I'll talk about at length in a few minutes, is more of a conventional mystery. The other thing to be said about the novel's structure is that you'll notice the chapters are uniformly short. They're no more than about 8 pages or 2,000 words. I did this because I think it helps to keep the book moving. You can read this book very quickly. Now, the Kindle version rates the average reading time for this book at 6 hours and 56 minutes. And a couple weeks ago, my sister back in Pennsylvania told me she read the whole book straight through in 6 hours. Now, this might seem like a simple and obvious thing, but I think the quickness means that as readers, you have the same urgency as the story. I also think that the short chapters also help to keep you reading. Several years ago, I heard a lecture by the novelist Jonathan Franzen. He said, one of the greatest challenges for any novel is that a reader can stop reading. If you look at customer reviews on Amazon, you might see a 3-letter designation, DNF, which means did not finish. This is equivalent, this is kind of the literary equivalent to walking out of a concert in the middle. So as a novelist, you don't want to give readers any reason to stop reading. And I was hoping that my structure would do that. You might also notice that nearly all chapters are divided into two shorter scenes. I did this because I had 5 detectives all working independently. And I wanted to have the stories continually switch point of view from one detective to another. It's a constantly shifting perspective. And I thought the best way to accommodate that shifting perspective was to divide the chapters into 2 scenes. What I didn't realize until later is that these scenes and this shifting perspective has an effect on you as a reader. So you're reading one scene, which is about Eddie, and the scene ends without being resolved. And so you read on to find out, well, what happened to Eddie? But then the next scene is about Eden, and that scene is unresolved, and you read on to find out what happened to her, but then the next scene is about another detective, and so on. And I was trying to figure out how to describe this effect. And I couldn't figure it out, but then my friend Laura Lee said, oh, that's a spiral. And so that's what it is. It's that you're going from one detective to another, and you keep reading to find out what's going to happen to them, and you're in this kind of circling around. The last thing I'll say about the plot is that each scene has a time stamp. Now, these are common in, say, Tom Clancy novels, and a lot of readers and writers don't like them. The only reason I did it was it's a simple mechanical device to emphasize the point that the detectives are working against the clock. You're not meant to keep track of the day and the time as a reader. I just wanted you to remind you that the clock is ticking. So as the cover says, this is a series. This is the first in a series. And it's this new series about these VCI detectives. The second book has already been written. It's a missing person case. The title is The Day He Left. And my publisher agreed to insert the first chapter of the second book at the end of this one, so you can actually read the beginning of the second chapter in this. The second book will be published a year from now in February 2022. All the major characters come back, all the detectives come back. And as I said a few minutes ago, it's a conventional mystery where the guilty party isn't identified until near the end. I don't want to give too much away about the second book. I'll just say a couple of things. One is that Eddie starts therapy in the second book, and Eden returns to that FBI case that nearly derailed her in the first book. Just the other day on Tuesday, my editor sent me a copy of the cover design for the second book, and it's exciting for me to see that take shape. So characters, let's just talk for a minute about the characters. The main characters are obviously these 5 detectives, and the leader of the team is Eddie Mahler. Now he's in the familiar vein of the troubled detective, but I wanted to avoid some of the common tropes of the troubled detectives, such as alcoholism and fits of violence. Since I had my own history of migraines, and since novelists are advised to write what they know, I decided to give Eddie a terrible migraine for the whole of the story. The progression of this headache and the stages of the headache are very specific. In fact, while I was writing, I had a separate outline just for the migraine. I named him Mahler after the 19th century Austrian composer Gustav Mahler, whose music often had themes of death. The other lead character is Eden Summers. She's new to the team. She studied criminal psychology in college, which happens to be Mount Holyoke College, where my daughter went to school in central Massachusetts. Eden is smart, academically inclined. She's kind of an amalgam of a number of young women I've known over the years. She's also a common device in literature. The reader sees a lot of the action through Eden's eyes. She's the learner, the student, she's learning the craft of investigation. And therefore, as a learner, she's in the same position as you, the reader. She's trying to figure out what's going on. I wanted to emphasize her innocence, so I called her Eden. The main villain in the story is Ben Thackeray, and he came from a photograph I saw on a magazine cover in a doctor's waiting room. It was a man with a very intense look on his face. So I took that cover and taped it on the wall of my office while I was writing the book. In general of characters, I'll say that they are very real to me when I'm writing. In fact, the dialogue comes easily because I have their voices in my head. So how did I come to write this novel? I first discovered mysteries when I finished graduate school. I spent 2 years living in England and getting a master's degree in the Victorian novel. I read dozens of those 800-page novels by Dickens, Thackeray, Trollope, and Henry James. And I loved that experience, but after 2 years, I really wanted to read something different. So I started reading mysteries. And the most influential ones I read at that time were a series of 10 novels with the detective Martin Beck. And they all take place in Sweden. And the authors are these husband and wife team of Swedish authors, Maj Sjöwall and Per Wahlöö. I'm sure I'm not doing this Swedish very well, but what I liked about these novels was they were about a team of detectives, and they were just ordinary people. They weren't superheroes. They fought with each other. They had arguments, but it was a team, and each one had a different personality and different skill. And I liked that idea. So I decided that when I had a chance to write a mystery of my own, I would invent a team like that. Now, the other way of asking this question, which my friend Karen asked the other day, is why did you decide to write this kind of book? That's a good question. And the simple answer is I find mysteries challenging and interesting to write. Also, these books have action scenes, which is not always true of literary novels, and action scenes are really fun to do. But at a deeper level, there's another reason, and this reason may get at another question, which is, why should you read this book? For me, mysteries or crime fiction use the seriousness of the subject matter, the taking of a human life, to get you hooked or get you engaged in the story. So you know right away that the story is about something serious and important. After that, what I try to do is to use the story to say something about what the characters experience, what we all experience. In this story, it's regret, loss, and fear, and overcoming those things. So I try to express those things in the characters in a interesting and new way. I don't know if I succeed, of course, but that's my goal. I wanted to say something about my process of writing and its authenticity to the subject matter. As I said earlier, the VCI team is a real thing, but I didn't research the real VCI before I wrote the book. In fact, I can admit now that I wrote the story about a team of detectives before I knew that there was such a thing as VCI. I just wrote about 5 detectives in the local police department. I was really focused on the story itself. To be honest, I wasn't sure I could do it, and I didn't want to bother the police until I knew I could succeed. After I finished, I met a retired VCI detective. In fact, he had Eddie Mahler's job for several years. And he read the manuscript and pointed out mistakes, which I tried to correct. Also, I joined a critique group, and one of the members of that group worked in the sheriff's office, and she helped me correct a lot of factual errors. there's a scene in this novel where Detective Rivas points to a fleeing suspect. And I remember that Tony told me that you would never point with a hand that was holding the gun in case the act of pointing pulled the trigger. In 2018, after the first book was done, I took a class through my local police department called the Citizens Police Academy. And this course introduced me to the whole police department and helped me write the second book. Now, some things in this book are not realistic to the real police department, and they usually involve practices and jurisdictions. For instance, in real life, police officers would never go alone into a possibly dangerous situation, while you'll see mine do that several times. And the real detectives on the BCI team are rotated out of that team after about 5 to 6 years. And mine are going to obviously stay there for a longer time. So I try to make things plausible to reality. But for me, the most important things are the story and the characters. So I make things up. And there's a tradition of that among mystery writers. For example, the great Irish mystery writer, Tana French, writes about something called the Dublin Murder Squad, which doesn't actually exist. Overall, what I try to do is to strike a balance. I try to write a good story with characters that you care about. On the other hand, I try to get the things about the detectives right. The retired VCI detective, who I mentioned a minute ago, told me that several years ago, he read a novel by another author, and after 30 pages, the novel was so unrealistic to police practices that he wanted to throw the book across the room. So what I'm looking for is that sweet spot where the average reader is engaged and entertained, but the reader who knows law enforcement doesn't want to throw my book across the room. The last thing I'll say about my process is that I'm a great believer in rewriting. For about 7 years, I've been a member of a local critique group with 3 other mystery writers. We meet every 2 weeks and review each other's pages. Each of us takes a different perspective, so we get a range of comments. And they've helped me enormously to make my novels better than they would have been. So with that group, I rewrote the whole of The Silenced Women twice, the whole book. And within that process, I also rewrote many chapters more often than that. For example, chapter 22, scene 1, describes Steve Frames in his car late at night going down the 101 freeway. I'm not going to say any more about that for those of you who haven't read it, but I rewrote those 4 pages more than 40 times, adding words, taking out words, rewriting sentences. I don't know if I made it better. I hope I did, but that's an example of rewriting. I read recently that Ernest Hemingway had 45 different endings to A Farewell to Arms. So I guess I'm not alone in doing a lot of rewriting. So the last thing I want to talk about is research. This book has a lot of details. It has details about guns, drugs, bird watching, martial arts, computer hacking, bipolar disorder, 18th century paintings, and other subjects. Obviously, I didn't know about those things, so I did a lot of research by reading and using online sources. Google search helped me a lot. Years ago, when I was researching an earlier novel that I eventually self-published, I did a lot of library research. This was before Google. My daughter was at home at that time, and she was teaching violin lessons in our living room. And she used to complain about the books I left lying around about handguns and drugs. For The Silenced Women, I also visited places like Spring Lake Park and a San Francisco high-rise. To be honest, I wasn't very good at exploring these places. I think I always asked the wrong questions. I can summarize that experience best, I think, as someone in authority saying to me, "Sir, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave now. But I found that it was better if I could see the places in the story so I could describe them with enough detail so that you as the reader could picture them. So I'm going to end my talk there, and I'd like to read a short excerpt from the novel, and when I'm finished, we can do the questions. So this is from the opening. The dead woman possessed a rare beauty, Eddie Mahler thought, as he looked at the thin, sculpted face and the soft down of her skin, the handsomeness spoiled now by an uneven line of dried blood falling loosely around the throat like a necklace come undone. The victim lay on her side on the park bench, the body wrapped in a red woolen blanket from shoulders to feet. Mahler guessed her to be nearly 6 feet and in her mid-20s. Streaks of red dye had been inexpertly applied through the bangs of brown hair. The eyes were closed, the lips slightly parted, as if she were about to speak. For an instant, he imagined the sound of her voice, a word or two left behind hanging in the air. Then a car door slammed behind him and Mahler's attention went back up the hill to the parking lot. The crime scene techs had arrived and 2 members of his violent crime investigation or VCI team were waiting for him with a park ranger. The bench sat on a hillside in Spring Lake Park, Santa Rosa's largest public park, beside a stand of oaks with a view of the water. Below the bench, the slope dropped sharply to an access road before falling all the way to the lake's edge. Valley fog diffused the early light and muted the sounds of the ghostly joggers and dog walkers traveling through the mist along the lake shore. An hour earlier, a call from Detective Martin Coyle had brought Mahler to the park. Now Coyle and a new investigator, Eden Summers, were giving him his space, but checking every few minutes for a signal to join him. Beyond the crime scene tape, a small group of spectators had gathered to peer down at the bench. Mahler was short and powerfully built. He had close-cropped hair and wore a flannel shirt, jeans, and a golf jacket. A takeout coffee cup kept one hand warm while his other hand was shoved in a pocket of his jeans. He had awakened the night before with a migraine, the pain concentrated behind his eyes. For 10 minutes, he lay without moving, all his attention focused on the intense headache. Then he rose carefully on an elbow to get an Imitrex from the bedside table. He slid the tiny pill onto his tongue and waited for its bitter taste to spread across the front of his mouth. When the pill was gone, he dropped 3 Advil in his palm and swallowed them with water. He eased back into bed and was nearly asleep when his cell went off with a call from Coyle. Now, here in the park, the migraine's intensity lessened, leaving him with a dull ache and sore neck muscles. He turned again to the woman. Without touching the body, Mahler knew from the blood trail at her neck that a deep wound would be found on the back of her head. He could also tell from the absence of blood on the bench and ground and the body's position that the woman had been placed on the bench post-mortem. He thought of the line at the end of the old film, Sunset Boulevard, where William Holden says, "Funny how gentle people get with you once you're dead." Closer up, he could see the top of her shoulders and the edge of a dark silk blouse. In the left earlobe, a pierced earring in the shape of a hollow star. The heavy fabric blanket covering her had traces of blonde fibers, animal hair, maybe a dog. Mahler had viewed the bodies of homicide victims for a dozen years, but never got used to it. He felt how his presence invaded the victim's intimacy with her death. He taught himself to see what he needed, to focus on the manner of interruption. The large caliber bullet opening the side of a gang member's head, or the knife wound on a farm worker's chest that left no other trace than an uneven pencil-thin line across his flesh. At the start, a veteran homicide cop named Tommy Woodhouse told him, "When you feel like looking away, that's when you should look." Now Mahler bent close to the victim and studied the dried blood on her neck. Beside the blood, he saw the dark shadows of bruised skin. The sight staggered him. As he rose, his legs weakened, and he held out an arm to balance himself. He looked as far from the body as he could, towards the distant lake, its quiet surface just visible in the fog. He thought of the other 2 times he had been called to the same park, to places across the lake, and stood beside the bodies of young women, the first in jeans and sweater, the second in running gear, both face down and so perfectly still among the native ryegrass and manzanita, they seemed like something new and terrible growing there. Mahler drank more coffee and felt his hand squeezing the cup. He waited to recover his balance. Then he looked up the hill and nodded. He wanted to be alone, not to have the conversation that was to come. So now, Jamie, I'm ready if you want to do the Q&A.
Let's do that. That was fantastic. Thank you. I
Thank
love when authors do readings. It feels extra special. So,
Well done.
yeah, let's get to questions because we do have quite a few. And for all of you out there, we probably will have time. So don't, feel free to keep submitting your questions and comments as they come up. Let's start with a question from Lee. Was Eddie Mahler based on anyone in particular?
No, not anyone in particular. He's kind of a collection of a number of things. He has some of my own qualities, particularly the headache and the obsessing about things. But no, I really just made him up. I wanted to explore some areas of things like responsibility and regret. And so he gave me the chance to do that. I gave him probably a different background than a lot of police detectives might have. I mean, he went to Princeton, he was in the Army, but he's not based on anyone I knew. He's definitely not based on my friend, the VCI detective. I made him up before I met Tom.
Sorry, I forgot I was on mute. We also have a comment and a great comment from Brian Fies. I remember we had an event with you and you were lovely. And everyone buy a fire story too. But his comment is, if you have time to spare and want to charm your audience, I suggest you share the grape knife story. It's my favorite, though not from this book. Can't go wrong with the grape knife story. The grape knife story. In any case, congratulations on a book launch. Hope I can attend the next one in real life.
Okay. All right. Well, Brian, I anticipated this. I can tell the grape knife story. So this is a novel that I eventually self-published, and it's called Teller. And there's a scene near the end where it all takes place again in Sonoma County. And there's a scene near the end in which one character stabs another one with a grape knife. So this is a grape knife. You see that? It's about 7 inches long. And
oh my goodness.
The blade is about 3 inches. So it's very small. You can see it's, anyway, one character stabs, this is in Sonoma County, these are used for cutting the clusters off the vine at harvest time. And it's a very common tool. But as I said, there's a scene near the end where one character stabs another with this. And I had written a scene and I was talking, I think it was to my friend Robert, who might be on this call too. And I said, I described the scene and he said, I don't think you can stab someone with a grape knife. And since I didn't actually have one, I thought, well, maybe he's right. So I got up from my desk and I drove over to Sebastopol and I went to a hardware store and I bought a grape knife. And This was in January. So when I got up to the cash register, the clerk said, well, this is January. It's an odd time to be buying a harvest knife. I think he was just trying to make conversation. And I was so intent on looking at it and trying to answer my own question that before I knew it, I said, well, I didn't buy this for harvest. I wanted to see if it was possible to stab somebody with this. And of course, this cashier looked horrified and sort of backed away from me. And after that, everything I said just made it worse. I said, well, I don't actually want to stab somebody. I'm just writing a story about someone who does. And you might be interested that the vineyard I'm describing is right near here. And it just got worse. And I had to leave the store. But anyway, that's the grape knife story.
Oh my goodness. So did you drop the question or did you ever figure it out?
So I decided that yes, it was possible to do that if you wanted to. I don't recommend it, obviously, but
It's a great story. Thanks for the suggestion. Alan is wondering why the migraines, literal blind spot versus figurative blind spot, Ree Summers.
that's an interesting question. I hadn't thought of that. It's yeah, it at some point he does experience these things called scotoma, and I had migraines for about 15 years. I never had scotoma. My sister told me she did, and they actually, make you blind temporarily. In Eddie's case, it's something that goes across your eye, and it means that you can't see very clearly. You're not completely blind. And I read a book by Oliver Sacks, the neurologist, called Migraine, and he had drawings of scotoma in the book. And so I used that to describe them. But yeah, I wanted that that particular symptom so that he would be unable to see at various times in the novel. And it's literally taking away his vision. But you can certainly see it symbolically as well. I also wanted the intensity of the headache to match the intensity of his own feelings of regret and inadequacy. And a migraine headache is really just like a single point in your head. It really concentrates the pain. And I wanted that to be kind of emblematic of what he was going through.
Thanks for answering that for us. Susan is wondering, what did you do before you started writing? How did you get interested in writing?
So I've been writing and editing my whole life. As I say, I went to graduate school and studied a Victorian novel. And by the time I finished that course, I decided I didn't want to teach, even though I had a literature degree. And I knew I wanted to work with words. So I became an editor, and I worked as an editor for years and gradually taught myself to be a science writer. And I'm still doing that. I'm still working part-time. But I've had various jobs with different clients, and it's all been about writing. And I've realized recently that all that experience actually helped me to be a fiction writer. It taught me about how to construct a piece, what comes first, second, and third. And I don't regret any of it. It was all very good training for what I'm doing now.
And the second part of your question, Susan, about whether he will autograph books, he will be sending in signed book plates. So the second best thing we can do, given all of COVID, is to get signed book plates. Our next question is from Virginia. When writing your series, how many hours do you write in a day, and how do you compartmentalize so that you don't take the characters with you the rest of the day?
So I write about 4 or 5 hours a day in the morning. I find it I'm not as clear-headed in the afternoon and evening, so I write early in the morning. The part about not carrying the characters is not easy. I mean, I end up thinking about them all the time, and they sometimes keep me awake at night. But I try to just write a few hours in a day. When I was working full time, when I first started writing The Silenced Women, I was working full time, and I would only write on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday early in the morning. And uh, that was really the only time I could do it.
It's a good, yeah, it seems like it'd be something you'd need to kind of
Yeah.
compartmentalize to some degree. Karen is wondering, why do you use the first name of the female detective, but the last names of the male detectives?
So I have no good answer to that. I can just say that there is a kind of tradition with that. If you read the novels of Robert B. Parker, he writes his detective is named Spencer, and all his mysteries take place in Boston. And I noticed that he did that. I think my reason, the only thing I can say is that I loved the name Eden, and I wanted to call her that. I didn't want to call her Summers. And so I made an exception for her. She's the only character that's true of, and it's for no other good reason than I like that name.
It's a perfect segue. Billy is wondering, as you develop the character of Eden in successive books, will your readers see her having a love interest?
Absolutely. I don't want to give away too much about the third book, but that's definitely part of it. Yeah.
Good news. Okay, Heather is wondering, what was more difficult, writing the beginning or writing the ending?
Of this book, the ending definitely. There's a couple stories about that. I worked with an editor on this book, and she didn't give me a lot of changes, but most of her changes were at the end. And I had a lot of good, what I thought were terrific passages at the end. Well, I can't say too much because people haven't read it, but there's several very good scenes near the end. And I had some terrific passages where I kind of described in detail what was actually happening. And my editor said, at the end of a novel like this, you need to keep the pace up. In fact, you should speed it up because readers want to find out what is going to happen. And so she went in and said, I would suggest you take away this, 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 and this. And for any writer, it's hard having someone do that to your work. But I spent a couple days thinking about it, and I thought, she's absolutely right. And so I took out big chunks to make it go faster at the end. The other thing I'll say is that I published an essay a couple weeks ago in Crime Spree magazine, and it is specifically the last sentences of 5 crime novels. And I wrote it because there's a kind of cliche about writers should write a great first sentence and a great opening. And I think that's true, but I think they should end the books as well. And that there's a lot of novels which come to the end and they kind of just drop off the edge. And so I wrote this essay, and it looks at these 5 crime novels and the last sentences and why they're great endings. And I think endings are just as important as the opening.
I love that. I love that. But it probably makes it extra hard to wait for the second book.
Yes.
Kind of along those lines, Virginia was wondering, how much influence does an editor have over the final book?
So I'm new to this, so I may not be the best person to answer this question, but in my case, I had 2 editors, and they both said, we think you should consider these things. They never said you have to do this. I would sometimes, I've learned one lesson is that when someone tells you to change something, you shouldn't make a snap decision. You should sleep on it. And so I would look at the changes and I would think about it overnight, and then I'd come back to it. In almost every case, I did what my editors suggested. In my case, they did not make any major changes. The biggest changes that were at the end of the book, which I already described. And those were just a matter of taking out a paragraph or a couple sentences. And so they seemed right to me. And from talking to other writers, I think a good editor would never insist that you do something, but they would explain the reasons for it. My editors both, when I talked to them, they would say, here's why I did this. In the second book, the editor made a couple of suggestions which I did not take. They were very minor, but I just didn't think they were an improvement. So I think a good editor would allow the writer to do what he or she wants.
Thanks for that. Karen is wondering, do you prefer to write about the good guys or the bad guys?
I definitely the good guys. Partly is that I feel a real affection for Eddie and Eden. In fact, when I first turned in the book and I was waiting to hear from the editor, as my wife will tell you, I always think of the worst case. And I thought, if this editor says you need to get rid of this character, Eden, I was going to just pull the book, because Eden is really my favorite character. And I really enjoy trying to describe the way she's thinking. As far as the bad guys are concerned, in both this book and the second book, I tried to make them plausible. I didn't really enjoy being in Ben Thackeray's head. It was it was a very dark place to be. So I didn't enjoy that as much. I tried to make it, an interesting and not grotesque description, but I definitely enjoyed writing the detectives better.
That's awesome. Morgan is wondering, did you finish writing this book prior to COVID?
Yes, I finished writing this book actually several years ago, well before COVID. I finished writing the second book the last summer in the middle of COVID. COVID doesn't play a part in that book at all. I haven't thought about how it'll affect the third book, but no, I wrote it before that.
Well, that kind of, my last question for all authors is, what's next? What can we expect next from you? But now we know, but any idea of when we can look out for the second book?
The third book. The second book. Yeah, the third book, I'm just starting it and starting to figure out the plot and where it's going. For those of you locally, I'm thinking of including the wildfires, and I'm just starting to kind of find my way with it. I'd say it's going to be at least a couple years before I get through it. I'm also writing at the same time simultaneously another novel that's not a mystery. It's a literary novel about someone who has a heart attack. And that is nearly finished. I think I've written about 70,000 words. So that actually might come out before the third mystery. We'll see.
Well, that's exciting. We'll be sure to look out for it. And, including the fires, gosh, could it be any more scary?
Yeah.
It makes it all real for us here.
Yes.
I want to thank you again, and thank you to everyone who posted questions and comments. And just a reminder that you will all receive an email tomorrow with a link to this recording, a link to purchase the book, including the discount code, and we'll also include how to get the book plate. Essentially, we'll have it so that when you order through the website and use your discount code or not, I mean, it's up to you, we will hold them until we get the book plates and then get them to you. So thank you all. I am going to let Frederick take us out tonight, and thank you again. I hope to see you in the near future when COVID is gone.
So thanks, Jamie. I want to say just a couple of quick things. One is if you're part of a book club and you want to read this book, I'd be happy to do a Zoom call with you. There's more information about the books on my website, frederickweisel.com. And when you're finished reading the book, if you feel so inclined, please write a review on Amazon or Goodreads. And the last thing I'll say is I want to thank all my family and friends who joined us tonight. And I appreciate all your support over the years. So thank you very much for coming.